In the year 1187, a Kurdish Muslim warrior did what no one else could. He recaptured Jerusalem, the holiest city for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, after 88 years of Crusader rule. But unlike the Crusaders who had slaughtered its people in 1099, this man forgave them. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, or you know him as Saladin. Today, we trace his journey from a soft boy who just wanted to write poetry to one of the most respected military leaders in history. Yusuf was born in 1137 in the city of Tikrit, modern-day Iraq. His father Ayyub and uncle Shirkuh were Kurdish commanders working for the Zengid dynasty, but the family was soon expelled from Tikrit on the very night Yusuf was born, because his uncle killed a Christian official in a feud. So young Yusuf grew up in Baalbek and later in Damascus, the beating heart of Islamic Syria. As a child, Yusuf was not naturally drawn to war. He loved religious studies, poetry, and the Quran. He was described as shy, soft-spoken, and more interested in prayer than in swordplay. But the world around him was changing. Crusaders from Europe had taken Jerusalem in 1099 and were pushing deeper into Muslim lands. At 14, Yusuf was given his first military role, but he hated it. He asked to leave the army. His uncle Shirkuh laughed and said, "You will forget poetry when arrows are flying past your ears." And he was right. By 1164, Saladin joined his uncle's campaign to Egypt. The Crusaders and the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt were locked in a deadly struggle. Shirkuh's goal was to bring Egypt under Syrian control. 3 campaigns were fought. In 1169, Shirkuh finally conquered Egypt, but then he suddenly died. The Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din had a problem. He needed someone loyal to hold Egypt. Who did he choose? The young, seemingly harmless Yusuf. At 32 years old, Saladin became vizier of Egypt. Nobody expected him to succeed. He was too young, too gentle, and surrounded by enemies, both Crusaders and jealous Fatimid officials. But Saladin did something brilliant. He slowly erased the Shia Fatimid Caliphate and restored Sunni rule in Egypt, all without a civil war. Then he built an army loyal only to him. In 1174, Nur ad-Din, his former master, died. Saladin now had a choice: surrender his power to Nur ad-Din's young son or take it for himself. He chose the latter, and thus began a 10-year campaign to unite the Muslim world, from Egypt to Syria, from Yemen to Mosul. He was not a conquering tyrant. He paid for his armies with his own wealth, gave land to his generals, and never raised taxes on the poor. But his goal was fixed: to retake Jerusalem. But before Saladin could take Jerusalem, he faced one of the strangest and bravest enemies in history, a teenage king covered in leprosy. His name was Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. In 1177, Saladin marched from Egypt with 26,000 soldiers, expecting little resistance. The young Baldwin, only 16 years old, already disfigured by leprosy, had only 500 knights and a few thousand foot soldiers. Everyone told him to retreat. Instead, he rode straight at Saladin. On November 25th, 1177, at the Battle of Montgizard, Saladin divided his army to plunder surrounding villages while the rest waited in their tents. Baldwin's small force launched a surprise attack. Saladin and his army, who were in the tent, were caught off guard. His personal guard was almost wiped out. Saladin himself barely escaped on a camel, fleeing across the desert. He lost nearly 90% of his men. It was the worst defeat of his entire life. Saladin did not stay defeated for long. 2 years later, in 1179, he struck back at the Crusader fortress of Jacob's Ford because Baldwin broke the agreement. This time, he learned from his mistakes and did not underestimate Baldwin by bringing siege engines and burning the castle to the ground. Baldwin IV could not stop him. The leprosy was worsening. He could no longer hold a sword or ride a horse. For the next 6 years, a strange, silent war ensued between the two. Baldwin and Saladin both began to make cautious decisions, knowing each other's capabilities. They both also sometimes officially called a truce many times. Saladin even showed his respect to Baldwin IV by bringing him a physician to try to treat the illness he was suffering from. However, amidst the truce that occurred repeatedly, there was a figure who often violated it. He was Renaud de Chatillon. he often attacked innocent caravans sent by Saladin. Renaud ordered his troops to kill the people inside and loot the contents. It was so bad that Saladin complained to Baldwin. Baldwin then replied that he could not force Renaud but swore to punish him. It is even said that in 1183, Renaud ordered his men to build ships in the Red Sea, with the intention of attacking the cities of Mecca and Medina. Fortunately, this was thwarted by Saladin's troops from Egypt. As a result of Renaud's mad action, Saladin led his army to Kerak Castle in the Ultra-Jourdain region to be besieged and attacked. Then, after hearing the news that Baldwin IV was moving to help, Saladin ordered his army to retreat back to Damascus. In 1185, at just 23 years old, King Baldwin IV finally died of leprosy. Before he died on his deathbed, he made his nobles swear to protect Jerusalem. He appointed his 5-year-old nephew king and Guy de Lusignan as regent. However, when Baldwin V was 8, he suddenly died, and Guy was appointed king. At that moment, the kingdom fell into civil war that divided two camps. Although it did not lead to open war, the opposition camp did not like Guy's approach to becoming king. In early 1187, while another truce was in place, it was the peak of Renaud's violations, with the attack on a caravan containing Saladin's sister, Sitt al-Sham. Upon hearing the news, Saladin was enraged and vowed to behead Renaud himself. With this news and the internal conflict plaguing the kingdom of Jerusalem, Saladin strengthened his resolve to lead his troops into an attack in an attempt to retake Jerusalem once again. On July 2nd, 1187, Saladin's first move was to besiege Raymond's city of Tiberias, deliberately to lure the Crusaders under Guy de Lusignan out to help. The next day, Guy ordered the Crusaders to march 25 kilometers under the scorching sun just to get to Tiberias. Then that night, while the Crusaders were resting in their tents in the dry conditions, Saladin ordered his archers to rain fire arrows on them, not to kill them, but to make the Crusaders even more panicked, tired, and dehydrated. After that hot incident, the next morning the exhausted Crusaders arrived at Hattin. They knew there was a spring in Hattin, so they hurried until they were finally stopped because their path was blocked by Saladin and his army. King Guy and his troops, who could not win if they faced them with their troops in this condition, set up tents at the horns of Hattin, hoping to hold out until conditions improved. But again, the Crusaders were trapped in a field without a water source for the second time. Saladin's army did not give the Crusaders a chance to rest. At night, they carried out a similar disturbance, this time by setting fire to dry grass around the hill, creating smoke and heat around the Crusaders' tents. After the Crusaders' army was completely exhausted and their formation was in disarray, Saladin launched his real attack and surrounded them from all directions. The result? Saladin's army won easily, with 20,000 Crusaders killed and the rest, including the nobles, were taken prisoner. After the Battle of Hattin ended, Guy de Lusignan, Renaud, several Templars and Hospitallers were brought before Saladin in his tent. Saladin, who knew they hadn't had a drink in a long time, gave Guy de Lusignan a glass of water first. After drinking, Guy gave his glass to Renaud, who was beside him. When Saladin saw Renaud drinking without any direct gain from Saladin himself, he knew that this man would not live long. Saladin asked, "How many times have you broken the treaty?" That's when Saladin took out his sword and immediately slit Renaud's throat. Guy de Lusignan, who saw that, was terrified, thinking that he was next. But Saladin went and said, "The king does not kill the king, but fate does it." Sometime after Saladin left the tent, a noble captive approached him. He was Baldwin de Bellin. He asked Saladin's permission to go to Jerusalem to fetch his wife and children. Saladin then allowed it, but on the condition that Baldwin would not fight again. After receiving permission from Saladin and being released, Baldwin went to Jerusalem. Because most of the Crusaders had fallen and the rest were captured by Saladin and his troops, Saladin easily conquered the cities around the kingdom of Jerusalem because there was no one to protect them. However, there was one city that Saladin could not conquer. He ultimately chose to withdraw his troops, having run out of time following the onset of winter storms. That city was Tyre, which was defended and led by Conrad of Montferrat. On the other hand, Baldwin, who has just arrived in Jerusalem, is greeted by the people of Jerusalem and refugees from surrounding cities that have been controlled by Saladin. They force Baldwin to lead the defense against Saladin and his army, who will invade Jerusalem. Baldwin, who saw that the people really needed protection, finally broke his oath to Saladin and would fight him to defend Jerusalem. He looked around and saw only 2 knights left in the city. Then Baldwin held a mass knighting for the noble youths and citizens to help him defend this city. And now the time has come. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin officially carried out a siege of Jerusalem by bringing approximately 60,000 troops to storm the walls of Jerusalem. Baldwin, who saw their horde coming, ordered the troops he led to organize their planned defensive positions to hold off Saladin's troops from the west. Meanwhile, Saladin, seeing that his troops' attacks from the west were ineffective, ordered his troops to shift their attacks to the east. They stopped on the Mount of Olives, a suitable place for Saladin to order his troops to shoot and destroy the walls using their trebuchets. Once completed, Saladin's forces launched a multi-day assault using trebuchets to destroy the walls. Jerusalem's defenders did not remain idle. They stationed archers and light trebuchets atop the walls, firing arrows and stones at the enemy, trying to disrupt their operators. Then at midnight, the civilian troops worked tirelessly to fill the cracks in the wall with sandbags and wooden blocks, so that the next projectile would not penetrate directly, while the Crusade soldiers stood guard in the towers. But it was useless. Saladin's troops continued their attack with their trebuchets until finally a point in the wall was breached. Baldwin, who knew that he could no longer withstand the attack of Saladin's large army and his supplies were also running out, took the initiative to negotiate in front of Saladin. Baldwin was then taken to meet Saladin. Upon arrival, he confronted Saladin directly. He warned Saladin that if Saladin and his army forced their way inside, he would order his men to kill the Muslim prisoners, burn the entire city, including the Dome of the Rock, and that he would prefer both of them die. Saladin, who did not want Jerusalem to be destroyed, told Baldwin that he swore to guarantee the safety of the Christian people inside and even return the king to them safely. He promised that it would be different from what the Crusaders did 88 years ago. Baldwin knew that Saladin's offer was better than the massacre and destruction. Then finally Baldwin declared that he would hand over Jerusalem honorably to Saladin. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered without a massacre. Saladin's first act? He forbade any revenge killings. He allowed Christians to leave peacefully with their belongings for a small ransom. And those who couldn't pay? He freed them anyway. Not a single church was looted. Not one civilian was murdered. Even his enemies were stunned. One Crusader chronicler wrote, "He was a man of great generosity, kindness, and virtue." Jerusalem returned to Muslim hands, accompanied by the display of the Holy Cross relic in Damascus as a trophy, signifying the success of Saladin and his army's efforts. The fall of Jerusalem shocked Europe. The first news reached Rome in 1187, just after the Crusaders' defeat at the Battle of Hattin. Acre fell to Saladin, and Jerusalem was rumored to follow. Pope Urbanus III, who heard this, immediately died of heart attack on October 20th. Then his successor, Pope Gregory VIII, issued a call for a crusade, which will be spread to all the major churches in Europe. 3 mighty kings answered the call: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England. The 3 of them took the oath of the cross and set out with the aim of recovering the kingdom of Jerusalem. The Third Crusade officially begins. However, to go to the Holy Lands requires very expensive costs, such as preparing ships, armies, and logistics. Richard then tried various ways to raise funds to travel there. He was willing to sell all his land and royal positions in England, even selling the city of London if anyone was interested. Meanwhile, Philip II was more calculating and ordered his officials to impose an additional 10% tax on the French peoples. Then Barbarossa left early in May 1189 at the age of 66. He left Regensburg with an army of around 100,000, the largest Crusader force in the Third Crusade. But fate did not give him what he had hoped for. When Barbarossa's armies set foot in the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Isaac II Angelus promised to give them safe passage. But Isaac II Angelus, who had a secret alliance with Saladin, and plus, that Isaac was afraid because he thought that Barbarossa would bring that many troops to take over Constantinople. So Isaac, deliberately betrayed Barbarossa by closing the market, attacking the troops, and detaining Barbarossa's envoy. Barbarossa was furious and ordered his army to begin besieging Byzantine cities, including Philippopolis and Adrianople. In Adrianople, Barbarossa's troops were trapped in the winter for 3 months. They were affected by disease, starvation, and were attacked by bandits. Then after 3 terrible months, winter ended, and Isaac announced the conclusion of a temporary peace treaty between the two sides. He sent ships for Barbarossa's Crusaders to cross to Asia Minor. After crossing into Seljuk Rum territory, Barbarossa's Crusaders did not seek official permission from Sultan Kilich Arslan II. This aroused suspicion, leading Sultan Arslan to believe the Crusaders were carrying out an armed invasion, as they had done during the First and Second Crusades. So the Seljuk Turkish troops attacked the Crusaders using scorched earth tactics. They burned fields and poisoned wells, then attacked using horse archers. At its peak, the Seljuk Turks launched a massive wave of attacks against the German Crusader encampment. However, the Crusaders were able to hold out and even win the battle. A few days later, envoys from Kilich Arslan II arrived and offered diplomacy, stating that the Sultan would guarantee the Crusaders' needs and provide safe passage, as long as the Crusaders were willing to wait for them to prepare it. Day after day passed. The visit from the Seljuk Turks still hadn't arrived to bring what the Crusaders wanted. Barbarossa, realizing this was fake diplomacy, immediately go on a rampage. He gathered his troops and divided them into 2, one as a diversion and the other focused on attacking the city of Iconium, led by Barbarossa's own son, Frederick VI of Swabia. Then the attack on the city of Iconium began on May 18th, 1190. After the walls were breached, the Crusaders immediately entered and looted the city. Arslan II panicked and gave everything the Crusaders asked for. 3 weeks after the Battle of Iconium, Barbarossa's army was stopped by the swift current of the Göksu River in front of them. Unable to wait for a bridge to be built, Barbarossa decided to cross the river himself. However, due to the strong current and his heavy armor, Barbarossa was swept away. He tried to swim, but his heart weakened by age and exhaustion. Then he drowned. The Crusaders who managed to rescue his body were in deep shock. They tried to preserve his body in vinegar for burial in Jerusalem, as he had vowed, but failed. So they buried his 3 body parts in 3 different locations. Without Barbarossa, their morale was shattered. Many of them deserted and did not join the war until only about 5,000 men arrived at the battlefield, led by Frederick VI of Swabia. They then engaged Saladin's forces at Acre, alongside Guy de Lusignan, who attacked Acre first on 28 August 1189. And sometime later, Frederick VI of Swabia died of illness, shifted to Philip II of France. He departed with his French troops in July 1190, choosing to travel by sea from Genoa. When he arrived at Acre on April 20th, 1191, the city had been besieged by Crusaders for 2 years and was still under siege. Philip II then assisted the local Crusaders under Guy de Lusignan and the remnants of Barbarossa's forces in carrying out the siege. On the other hand, Richard actually left earlier than Philip in April 1190. However, he was late because he was hit by a big storm on the way, and 3 of Richard's ships were stranded in Cyprus, including the ship carrying his fiancée and his sister. The ruler of Cyprus at the time, Isaac Komnenos, arrested and seized Richard's entourage. Richard, unwilling to accept this, landed at Limassol in May 1191 and defeated Isaac Komnenos in just 2 weeks. Komnenos was then imprisoned, and Richard took over the entire island to serve as a logistical base for the Crusaders. Plus, he married his fiancée there. After taking care of Cyprus, Richard continued his journey to the battlefield and arrived at Acre on June 8, 1191. When he arrived, Acre was in a critical condition for the Muslims. Thanks to the effective cooperation between Richard and Philippe, they established a naval blockade to cut off Muslim supply lines and thicken dug trenches to slow down external attacks, thereby allowing the Crusader siege engines to focus their fire on the city walls. Saladin offered a large ransom for both of them and an agreement to release the Christian captives only if they both called off the invasion, but they both refused. And finally, on July 12, 1191, Acre fell into Christian hands. Saladin, who heard that the city of Acre had fallen, was sad. He felt he had failed to protect the Muslims. Luckily for Saladin, the Crusaders there would experience internal problems that would cause them to split apart. After the capture of Acre, Richard and Philip divided the spoils and the right to rule the city into two main portions. Leopold V of Austria, who felt he had also played a role in the Battle of Acre by leading the remaining German Crusaders, succeeded Frederick VI of Swabia. He then raising the flag of the Duchy of Austria alongside Richard and Philip's. Seeing that, Richard's soldiers immediately lowered Leopold's flag and threw it into the moat, considering Leopold's status unequal to that of a king. Leopold, upon learning of this, felt insulted and the next day immediately ordered his German crusaders to leave the battlefield with him. The internal problems were not yet resolved. Now Richard and Felipe were arguing over who should be king of Jerusalem, Guy or Conrad. Then the result was that Guy remained king while Conrad became the rightful heir. After the problem was resolved, Philip, who had fallen ill, decided to return home and preferred to take care of France. He, leaving the French army to be led by Richard, he promised that he would not take Richard's land there. Richard was then left alone to continue his mission to recover the kingdom of Jerusalem. And this is the beginning of the rivalry between Richard and Saladin. On August 20th, 1191, Richard executed 2,700 Muslim prisoners and sent their heads to Saladin. Saladin, enraged, then ordered his soldiers to also execute Christian prisoners in retaliation. Switched to Richard, he is planning how to get to Jaffa, because he will use Jaffa as a base to attack the city of Jerusalem. He knows that if he leaves Acre only by land, he will surely suffer the same fate as Guy. So he makes a strategy that Saladin did not expect. On August 22nd, 1191, Richard made a long march to Jaffa. He and his armies formed a steel box and then moved along the coastal route. He also ordered English ships at sea to sail alongside, bringing food and water to his troops. Saladin, who was aware of this, was at a loss as to how to deal with that formation. He couldn't completely encircle them, so he ordered his troops to disrupt Richard's marching army, luring his troops out of formation. However, the Crusaders remained focused on following Richard's orders to be patient and not to carry out charges yet. Until September 7th, 1191. When Richard and his troops were almost approaching Arsuf during the day, Saladin thought Richard's troops were exhausted, so he launched a large attack on Richard's rear guard, planning to ambush them. That's when Richard blew the trumpet and all the knights came out of their box formation together towards Saladin's troops. Saladin's armies, shocked by the sudden attack, were ultimately defeated. Around 7,000 Saladin troops were killed and the rest fled, compared to Richard's troops who died only around 700. After the battle, Richard arrived and captured the city of Jaffa without a fight. After capturing the city of Jaffa, Richard's daily life was mostly filled by negotiations with Saladin. Until one day, Richard felt that it was impossible for him to capture Jerusalem. He even had the strange idea of making a surprising offer to Saladin. He offered his younger sister to marry Saladin's younger brother, with the aim of making them both king and queen of Jerusalem, so that Jerusalem would not fall to anyone but be managed together by a Christian-Muslim couple. This offer was later rejected by several people, including the popes and even Richard's own younger sister. Saladin, who was initially interested, eventually declined as well, suspecting that it was part of Richard's plot for an internal coup. Then the days continued, when he felt everything was ready. Richard began his journey with his 20,000 troops to Jerusalem. Saladin, hearing about this, found a solution. Saladin knew he might lose again if he fought directly against Richard's troops, so he would use an old tactic that he guaranteed Richard would not be able to solve with his sword. Back to the Crusaders led by Richard. During their journey, they were confronted by unfavorable weather. A rainstorm hit them, and it continued until the ground they were crossing turned to mud. Because of the mud, many of the siege engines, supply carts, and horses of the Crusaders were trapped. Then, on a cold night, the Crusaders couldn't find any wood to make a fire, so they were forced to sleep in wet tents with wet clothes. Many of them ended up suffering from hypothermia and pneumonia as a result. Even in such conditions, Richard continued his journey until they arrived at Beit Nuba in January 1192. There, it was actually only 19 kilometers from Jerusalem if Richard wanted to continue advancing. But when he saw the condition of his troops, the dwindling logistical supplies in his war council that asked to turn back to Jaffa, Richard then decided to turn back to avoid a foolish death. After successfully returning to Jaffa, Richard saw that most of the Crusaders had returned with lingering illnesses, and some had even died on the journey. Saddened and unwilling to let this happen again, Richard decided to prepare better and return when summer arrived. The season that Richard had been hoping for finally arrived. He prepared his preparations thoroughly and tried once again to travel to Jerusalem with his Crusaders. He was sure that because this was summer, the storm that would hinder them before would not come back. But it seems Richard was wrong. During their journey, the day felt extremely hot there. The Crusaders' water supply quickly ran out, and they needed more. Some of them tried drinking water from the well, but suddenly, they experienced severe diarrhea. The Crusaders did not yet know that Saladin's troops were the ones doing it. They put animal carcasses and dung into the water in several wells. Saladin's troops also cut down trees and drained the oasis in the area. Then, when the Crusaders were relying on their only hope, namely the supply of chariots from Jaffa, Saladin simply just ordered his troops to cut them down. Due to extreme thirst, many Crusaders died of dehydration. Richard and his Crusaders, who arrived at Beit Nuba for the second time in June 1192, discussed their situation. Some soldiers urged to continue their attack on Jerusalem to ensure their arduous journey was worth it, while Richard refused. He declared, "If we attack, we will all die," and ordered his troops to return to Jaffa. After Richard and his troops safely returned to Jaffa again, the number of Crusaders who fell ill increased, and some did not survive. Even Richard fell victim, causing him to feel sick, until it was reported that as many as around 4,000, or 30% of the Crusaders, died as a result of Saladin's old tactics. A month later, when Richard's illness had not yet healed, he instead heard news that his younger brother, John Lachlan and Philippe, were working together to seize his land and overthrow him. The situation was so critical that Philippe managed to seize Gizors. After hearing that, Richard immediately moved to Acre for prepare to return home so he can save his own kingdom. Saladin, who seeing a golden opportunity when Richard abandoned Jaffa, immediately assembled a large army to retake Jaffa. On July 27th, Saladin's forces arrived at Jaffa and began their assault. 2 days later, when the city walls were breached, Saladin's army entered the city and killed some of the garrison. The remainder of Richard's army retreated to the citadel, and some escaped by ship to seek aid from Richard in Acre. Richard, hearing the news that Jaffa was under attack, immediately rushed there to help protect it. From a distance, Richard saw Saladin's flag already flying over the city. Without waiting, he jumped from the ship, wading chest deep in the seawater, followed by 80 of his knights. Saladin didn't expect Richard to be so bold. As a result, Saladin's troops were caught off guard and be slaughtered by Richard's forces. The city of Jaffa was then saved at the last moment. Feeling defeated because he was unaware, Saladin ordered his troops to retreat and attack again if there was another opportunity. Then Saladin returned with his troops on August 5th, 1192, to attack Richard's camp in the early hours of the morning, even though he was still sick. Richard, who heard the news that Saladin's troops were attacking, put on his armor and prepared to defend with his soldiers. He led the defensive formation during the fight against Saladin's troops. The Battle of Jaffa begins once again. During the war, when Richard was at fighting, there was a moment that his horse was getting hit by an arrow and died. However, he still continued fighting. When looking from a distance, then found a king fighting on foot, Saladin ordered his men to send new horses for Richard. Richard then accepted the horse and continued helping his soldiers repel Saladin's troops. After successfully repelling them, Richard realized one thing: if this continued, his own kingdom would be neglected and easily seized by Philip and Richard's own younger brother, John. So Richard tried to make a final agreement to negotiate with Saladin. Richard made the Treaty of Jaffa, which stated that Jerusalem would remain Muslim, but Christians could visit freely. The Crusaders kept a thin strip of land along the coast. Saladin agreed to it. Then, on September 2nd, 1192, Saladin and Richard agreed to a truce. It was not a victory for either side, but for Saladin, it was enough. He had done what no one else had, kept Jerusalem. And that's how their rivalry ended. They never met face to face, but they negotiated like brothers, to the point where they both praised each other. Saladin, who often aided the Crusaders and wanted a fair fight, proved Richard's assumptions wrong. Saladin wasn't as evil as European propaganda had claimed. After the war ended, did Saladin rest? No, he immediately went back to work taking care of his dynasty. He patrolled from Palestine to Syria, made sure the forts were repaired, adjudicated land disputes, and disbanded the army in an orderly manner. He traveled from Jerusalem all the way back to Damascus, always on horseback. Upon arriving in Damascus, instead of taking a complete rest, Saladin held a gathering every day from dawn until evening prayer, while addressing the people's complaints, distributing the spoils of war. Then he also did not forget to inspect schools and hospitals in Damascus. Sometimes, if he found an orphanage lacking funds, Saladin would cover it with his own personal funds. So that's how busy Saladin's reign was. It said he never sat for more than an hour and often only slept for 3 to 4 hours. Plus, as he was approaching his 50s, his body couldn't be forced to work that hard, but he kept doing it. Because of that, on February 20th, 1193, Saladin started to feel unwell. He lay feverish in his bed. Even so, Saladin insisted on signing state documents right there. Yet for a few days, he fell unconscious due to extreme exhaustion. Upon regaining consciousness, he asked for the Quran to be recited to him. Then he distributed his personal wealth. As his condition worsened, Saladin left a message for his sons. I commend you to God. He is the best of lords. Do not shed blood for my sake. Be merciful to the weak, for the strong will fear you if you are just. After delivering this message at dawn on March 4th, 1193, Saladin breathed his last at the age of 55. But because Saladin had given away almost all his personal wealth, there was not enough money in his treasury to pay for his own funeral. He was then buried in a simple wooden coffin, wrapped in a shroud. Saladin never wanted to be a hero. He was a man who preferred prayer and poetry to war, but when duty called, he became one of the greatest military leaders of the Middle Ages. Not because he was ruthless, but because he was merciful. In the West, poets praised him. Dante placed him among the virtuous pagans in the Divine Comedy. Sir Walter Scott wrote a romantic novel about him. Even some kings praised him as well. Yusuf ibn Ayyub showed the world that honor and war are not opposites. From Saladin, we can learn to be a lion with a heart, strong yet just, victorious yet generous, and respected by enemies yet loved by the people.